Hello, my friends. You are used to seeing me talk about ancient samples from the Bronze Age, from the Iron Age, from the Copper Age. But this time we are going to look at a sample from not any of those time periods, but actually from the modern time period. We are going to look at a sample from the present. We are going to look at a modern human who lived in 2019, who was from a 2019 study from the United States, a modern American man who's of Northwestern European descent, from what I could figure out based on his genome, based on his DNA. Northwest European, white American. What's interesting about his genome, why I'm making a video about him, is that he has schizophrenia, which is a very rare condition. Less than 1% of people are affected by this condition. This condition is inheritable, which means it is genetic. There is a genetic predisposition, and you can determine predisposition to schizophrenia using genetics. Hence, why it is so important to for me to cover his genome and his results with my trait predictor. Why I consider it to be so important to make this video. But also, I consider it quite important to see to just it's just very fascinating to me to see what kind of predisposition and what kind of as a person who's interested in science and interested in these topics, it just very it fascinates me on a deep level, on a deep biological level, to find out like how the human body works. It's very difficult to explain, but it's very interesting to me to find out how all of these variations and all these SNPs and all these genotypes actually correspond to phenotype, and how that correlates to traits such as being a warrior versus warrior, or having schizophrenia, traits like that. So as a researcher, it's very fascinating to me to find out how this correlation exists and whether this correlation even exists at all. And like I made a whole tool that predicts various traits about various traits like schizophrenia risk and bipolar risk and like risk for multiple sclerosis, stuff like that. So of course I know a little bit about how predisposition works and how various genes affect predisposition to various illnesses. Of course I understand some of it, but the thing is, I want to see it in practice. I want to see proof. I want to see um, I want to see proof of somebody who actually has this condition scoring a certain score with my trait predictor, right? So that's why it's very interesting. It's always very fascinating to me to see results like what I'm showing you here in this video. So let's get into the result. All right, so we're gonna start with the ethnic calculator results. We're gonna just get familiar with the subject that we're covering. With the ethnic calculator, for my own ethnicity calculator, he's scoring closest to Turkic from the Caspian steppe, followed by Funnel Beaker, followed by Volga, followed by Bell Beaker, and the closest mixture for him is a mixture of Yamne from Kalmykia plus Russians. So not a very precise prediction, considering that he is a Northwest European, as you can see with G25. So let me show you his results with G25, which is a lot more precise. You can see with G25 he's closest to Dutch and Germans and Welsh, which is a lot more precise. So he's essentially just a Northwestern European. Single. Let's try to model him. Free populations. So free populations, he's a mixture of French from Brittany plus Norwegian plus Hungarian. Seems like a typical um, American American mixture. Distance column to 0.5. Let's see if that changes anything. Yeah, so he does have a little bit of Eastern European admixture, actually. So that's kind of typical for Americans as well. With the Davidsky standard model, he's scoring half Samara Yamne plus 38% Barsin Neolithic plus 13% Western Hunter-Gatherer. Quite typical results for a Western European once again. But once again, that's very different from what he scores with my own ethnicity calculator, where seems to be scoring like a Eastern European actually. The closest to reality result with my ethnicity calculator is line 5 with the two-way oracle, where he's getting modeled as a mixture of French plus Livonian, which actually seems to be quite not as deranged, but it's still a little bit deranged, because half Livonian is still very deranged for him. So it looks like my calculator wasn't so good for ethnicity, but that's okay. Let's see what he scores for the national code calculator, which is a lot better. Let's see what he scores for phenotype, what he looks like. So for phenotype, looks like he has hazel color eyes, hazel eye color. Um, Hazel eye color, 10% likelihood for blue eyes with an amber center, 16% likelihood for brown eyes. So it looks like he has some kind of an intermediate or darkish eye color. For white American, hazel eyes is probably considered dark. For hair color, looks like he has dark brown hair. So he's for a white American, he's probably considered a little bit dark on the darker side. Dark brown hair, hazel eyes, and white skin tone. 92% likelihood of white skin tone. So he's white skin, dark brown hair, and hazel eyes. For hair texture, looks like he has got wavy or straight hair texture. And for nose shape, it looks like he has got Greek nose shape. Definitely Greek nose shape at 78% likelihood, and not snub nose shape. Okay, so for coloring related variants found in the file, it looks like he does not have blue eye haplotype 2. He does have blue eye haplotype 1. And he doesn't have a genotype for blue eye haplotype 3. Okay, very interesting. Um, and he actually has one light color variant for this variation of MC1R, which is also quite surprising, quite interesting. All right, so um, it's very interesting that he's scoring hazel eyes, dark brown hair, and white skin. So get familiar with the phenotype. Let's see what he scores for the phenotype oracle. For the oracle, it looks like he's looking um, quite, quite, quite dark for a white person, I would say. For an American white person, quite dark. So the closest phenotype is this, which is, I guess, looking French, I would say. The second closest phenotype is this, which is I don't even know what ethnicity this reminds me of. It just looks like a typical white person with hazel eyes. And the third closest phenotype is this, which looks Mediterranean, once again French, I would say. So the closest mixture is a mixture of, let's see, 50% this plus 50% this. The second closest mixture is 50% this plus 50% this. The third closest mixture is 50% this, 50% this. Very, very, very interesting. So essentially, he looks most likely something like this, a mixture of this and this, in terms of his appearance. Quite interesting. For his Y DNA is I1, which is a sort of a Germanic Northwest European lineage, and we already see that he's quite Germanic in his ancestry. So that's no surprise once again. Now that we got this information out of the way, so we familiarize ourselves with what he looks like, what his ethnicity is, let's move on to the interesting stuff, which is, let's start with biomarkers. For the biomarkers, looks like he has a predisposition to higher than average levels of vitamin D, lower than average levels of LDL cholesterol, which is really good, above average levels of HDL cholesterol, which is also really good. So far, really good to see. Above average levels of glucose, which is not good. Above average levels of hemoglobin, which is also not good. Below average level of blood pressure, which is good. Below average level of iron, so it looks like he does not carry any risk variants for hemochromatosis, which is good. Below average level of sex hormone binding globulin, which is also good. Below average level of red blood cell count, which is okay. Above average number of telomere base pairs, which is good. Actually, that's really high. He's scoring really high for the telomere base pairs. So he has a predisposition to live long, which is really good to see. Look at how far to the right the little thing is. So he's definitely has a predisposition to live long. Really good to see. And for height, he has a predisposition to be really short. So he's height-wise, his predisposition to be much shorter than average. But the height panel is not so precise here. I don't like it too much, to be honest. I don't really think it's very reliable. Just being honest right here. Okay. Let's see what he scores for the polygenic risk scores. This might be very interesting. So for migraine, he scores below average, significantly below average. For lupus, below average. Gout, very low score for gout. So essentially, very low score for gout. Thyroid cancer, very healthy. Eczema, very healthy. Glaucoma, below average for exfoliation glaucoma. Average for pigmentary glaucoma. Below average for open-angle glaucoma. Below average for primary congenital glaucoma. Below average for polycystic ovary syndrome. Average for cataracts. below average for age-related macular degeneration. So he's actually scoring below average for pretty much everything so far. He's got average score for rheumatoid arthritis, slightly above average score for rheumatoid arthritis. He's got below average score for Tourette's. He's got actually pretty high score for epilepsy, which is definitely very interesting. 1.8 times the average score for epilepsy. He's got slightly above average score for asthma. He's got below average score for leukemia. He's got average score for vitiligo, average score for myopia, slightly below average score for primary biliary cirrhosis, below average score for stroke, low score for male pattern hair loss, which is very surprising because he's a European, and Europeans tend to score higher for male pattern hair loss. So this is actually very surprising. It's surprising that he, as a European, is scoring so low for male pattern hair loss. Definitely an outlier result. Um, Low for atrial fibrillation, low for deep vein thrombosis, quite low for unipolar depression. But look at that, he's scoring very high for bipolar type 1, 1.9 times the average for bipolar type 1. And he's also scoring very high for schizophrenia, 2.3 times the average for schizophrenia. Very, very interesting. So he's scoring also he's scoring below average for type 2 diabetes, and he's scoring schizophrenia so far is the highest thing he's scored for. And he's scoring above average for type 1 diabetes. He's scoring above average for Alzheimer's, and he's scoring 10 times the average for multiple sclerosis. So he's scoring very high for multiple sclerosis as well. So the risks that he has are risks for multiple sclerosis and for schizophrenia. Those are the things he scores very high for. For cancer section, looks like he has 2 risk variants for breast cancer and 17 risk variants for testicular cancer at 24. And he has all the risk variants for imported risk variants for testicular cancer in the KIT-G gene, which are definitely quite important. So he's cooked when it comes to KIT-G gene risk variants for testicular cancer. Celiac disease, he has 4 risk variants for the celiac disease out of 12. Quite interesting. No risk variants for GSS. 4 risk variants for Crohn's disease out of 28. None of them are in the important variations. No risk variants for Riefenstein's. No risk variants for Parkinson's. 2 risk variants for Gilbert syndrome out of 6 total. Let's look them up. Let's do some research. I feel like this might be common. Yeah, this is common. Okay, this is common. So this is not that big of a deal. No risk variants for basal cell carcinoma. 1 risk variant for GCD, but this is common. No risk variants for Waardenburg syndrome. No risk variants for Treacher-Collins that are not common. So once again, quite typical. 2 risk variants for Pfeiffer syndrome, but they are once again common. 2 risk variants for FTAD, but they are once again common. Myosclerosis, 2 risk variants, but they are once again common. He has 4 risk variants for Hirschsprung disease, but they are not labeled common, which is quite interesting. Let's look them up. Let's see if they are common in reality or if they aren't. Okay, I think I might have to do some more. I think I might have to do some more advanced research right now. I hate doing this type of research. Okay, so they are common. They are common. Okay, so it's not that big of a deal. Not that big of a deal. All right. And for Fabry disease panel, no risk variance for Fabry disease. Really good. And no risk variance for Li-Fraumeni syndrome. Once again, no, not a big deal. So the only things that he really has to watch out for are multiple sclerosis. Let's scroll up to that. Where is that? Where is multiple sclerosis? Oh, where was that? It's right here. And schizophrenia, but multiple sclerosis is extremely rare. It's a very rare condition, so maybe he doesn't have to. Let's look up what does he have for the HLA gene. HLA gene panel. So yeah, for the HLA gene panel, he certainly is scoring very high for the highest odds of autoimmune disease. So, and let's see what else. If you just look up HLA in his file, yeah, he's scoring. He does have a lot of healthy genotypes in HLA as well. Like for the vitiligo panel, no HLA risk variance here. But for the multiple sclerosis risk variance, he certainly has a lot of risk carrier carrier genotypes in HLA for multiple sclerosis. So that's why he's scoring so high for the multiple sclerosis panel, because of the risk variance for multiple sclerosis in HLA. Okay. Well, anyway, let's get on to the monogenic traits and find out why he's scoring so high for schizophrenia. So for the Warrior versus Warrior panel, it looks like he's scoring intermediate between Warrior and Warrior phenotypes. He's GG in Comte Valmet variation, which means he's a Warrior in Comte, which is not even correct to say. He's Warrior in Comte Valmet, because there is a bunch of other genotypes here in Comte which also have to do with Warrior versus Warrior. So in this variation, RS4633, he's also Warrior. This variation, I'm not sure what the implications of it are in terms of Warrior versus Warrior and degradation of dopamine, but I know that it has some implications in odds of schizophrenia. So his genotype here is implicated in higher odds of schizophrenia, which is definitely very interesting, but it doesn't play a role in the calculation for the risk score. I don't include this variation for the calculation of the risk score. He's got GG here, which leads to slightly lower risk of schizophrenia. He's got GG in this variation, which leads to higher risk of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Now we're moving on to MAOB gene, which is a different gene, which is located on the X. And here he's got higher level of the MAOB enzyme, which higher level of the MAOB enzyme is sort of the enzyme that breaks down dopamine, which means higher level of this enzyme would imply quicker dopamine degradation, which would imply warrior genotype. So once again, it's a warrior kind of a genotype. Then he's got this genotype, which leads to lower odds of ADHD, Parkinson's, and one study found higher odds of depression. So this, I'm assuming, is more of a warrior genotype because lower odds of ADHD. This genotype in MAOB, once again, lower odds of ADHD. And then there's this genotype in MAOA, which is a warrior genotype. I explicitly labeled it as a warrior and leads to decreased MAOA activity. So it looks like overall, if you look at the genotypes in MAOA and MAOB, there's definitely some mix of warrior and warrior genotypes here. So that's why overall, if you look at the panel overall, he's scoring sort of equal between warrior and intermediate and warrior. For dopamine D2, looks like there's definitely a trend towards higher number of dopamine D2 receptor sites. Overall, there is a predisposition to... Let me close these tabs. They're useless. Overall, there's definitely a trend to more D2 receptors. So let's start with the no-go learner variants in Pro 19 He does not have any derived no-go learner variants. He's not a no-go learner. In Pro 19 he has GG. So more D2 receptor sites in the brain. This contributes to higher number of dopamine D2 receptor sites for this panel. He has all these genotypes which also increase the number of dopamine D2 receptor sites in the brain and higher odds of schizophrenia. All of these are sort of linked to each other, but also not really. The linkage there is kind of weak, not very strong. He has CT in this variation, which slightly lowers the risk of schizophrenia. He does not have any A alleles here, which would be very, very interesting. If he had any A alleles in this variation, his score for schizophrenia would have been, instead of, what was he scoring? 2 times, point something? Let's see. He was scoring 2.3 times. Instead of 2.3 times, he would be scoring 3 point something. So, well, maybe not, but he would be scoring much higher if he had, for example, AA genotype here. So him having GG genotype here definitely brought down his score for schizophrenia quite a lot. He does not have any alleles in TAC1, so he's got slightly higher number of dopamine D2 receptor sites in the brain and slightly lower risk of ADHD and alcoholism. Typical score, typical genotype for most humans. Most humans have GG in TAC1. Slightly number of dopamine D2 receptor sites in the brain is good for most people. Most people need this slightly higher number of dopamine D2 receptor sites in the brain to avoid things like burnout and lack of motivation. But obviously for him, it would be better for him if he had the A allele here, because it would avoid him the trouble of having schizophrenia. He has this genotype in DRD2, which leads to higher dopamine D2 receptor site availability. So overall, he has all these genotypes. He has all these genotypes which lead to more D2 receptor sites, and very few genotypes that lead to less. So he has this one genotype that leads to less, and also this one genotype that leads to less. But overall, most of the genotypes he has lead to more. Um, Moving on to DRD1, his genotypes for DRD1. DRD1 is not all that important when it comes to the risk of schizophrenia. It doesn't really play that big of a role, and even from the perspective of like from the perspective of the medical perspective, like when you take antipsychotics, they don't target D2 receptors. They don't target D1 receptors. They target exclusively D2 receptors. So dopamine D1 receptor gene is not particularly important when it comes to the risk score for schizophrenia, but it does play a role as well. So let's see what he scores for that. He's got this genotype, which leads to a slightly higher likelihood of autism and tobacco addiction. Slightly higher odds of autism and tobacco addiction, once again. Elevated risk of schizophrenia, higher odds of compulsive behavior in those affected by Parkinson's disease. This does not play any role in the calculation for the risk score, by the way. Plays no role whatsoever. Patients with schizophrenia may have a better response when treated clozapine as compared to patients with GT genotype. Very interesting. So depends on what he was treated with. If he was treated with clozapine, that might have a better outcome for him. In DRD3, he's got this genotype which corresponds to some protection from schizophrenia, but of course, this also doesn't play a role in the polygenic risk score calculation. And he's got this genotype in DRD4, which is implicated in a higher likelihood of schizophrenia. DRD4 actually plays a little bit of a higher role in schizophrenia than other genes like DRD1 and DRD3 and DRD5, because DRD4 actually has some similarity to DRD2. They're kind of like in a cluster together. Where DRD2 is, where D2 receptors are, D4 receptors are as well. So they're kind of like in a cluster together in the brain. So D4 and D2, they're kind of like best friends forever, right? So they're definitely interlinked together. Another genotype in DRD4 associated with lower odds of intellectual ability and ADHD, and another genotype in DRD4 which corresponds to lower odds of schizophrenia but slightly higher odds of various eating disorders, once again from this individual. So quite interesting, but none of this plays a role in the calculation for the polygenic risk score. All of this is just here displayed for the person to see, but it doesn't play. Most of this stuff, aside from the dopamine D2 receptor panel, doesn't play a role in the polygenic risk score because it's not well researched. For the 5-HT and serotonin, that has to do with the depression, but he was scoring below average for depression. So let's see what he scores for 5-HT and serotonin. Panel looks like he has a predisposition to intermediate levels of 5-HT and serotonin, intermediate predisposition to stuff like depression, anxiety, things like that. So he does not have long form 5-HT TLPR, he has short form 5-HT TLPR. Very, very interesting. And I'm not gonna go through all of this. This is too much uninteresting stuff to see. Another very interesting. All of this stuff is not in any of the particularly important genes, but it also plays a part in the mental health results section. So let's go through this as well. He has GG here, which is not associated with high risk for major depression, which is good for him. So he has some protection from major risk of depression. One allele for higher odds of depression, really interesting. Reduced odds of unipolar depression. So overall, he's not very predisposed to depression. He has TT in this variation of T rank 1. T rank 1 is pretty important for the odds of bipolar. So he has below average odds of bipolar and schizophrenia. He has TT in this variation of DISC 1. DISC 1 stands for disrupted and schizophrenia 1, which leads to somewhat lower odds of bipolar and schizophrenia. By the way, DISC 1 is like not particularly well researched, so it doesn't play a role in polygenic risk scores whatsoever. He has GG in this variation in here, which leads to no risk variance or psychosis in this variation of MIR 378F. Once again, very typical genotype. And he has homozygous major allele in ADCY2 gene, which is associated with decreased bipolar risk. This actually is quite well researched, and it does play a role in the polygenic risk score. and he has GG in his addition of ADCY2, which leads to a significant increase in the odds of bipolar disorder. This is also quite well researched, and it also plays a part in the polygenic risk score for both bipolar and for schizophrenia. Um, and he does not have any predisposition to Tourette syndrome. So there you go. That's his results for the mental health results section. This was probably the most important part of the results. For insomnia and sleep disorder panel, it looks like he does not have any predisposition to sleep disorders. All these are common genotypes. For PR and P gene panel, it looks like all of these are non-pathogenic variants. Really good to see. SLCA4 gene panel looks like he does not. He has this genotype which leads to increased risk for anxiety disorders. Very interesting. And this genotype which leads to higher risk of behavioral disorder. But also he has genotypes that leads to lower odds of behavioral disorders and less extreme alcoholism. For dwarfism, FGFR3, no risk variance for dwarfism. Really good to see. For gout, he was scoring really low for gout, so it looks like he does not have a predisposition to gout. Lupus, he was scoring low for lupus, and it looks like we know his polygenic risk score, so we don't have to look through this panel right now. For GCPD, looks like he has a low predisposition to anemia. We're gonna skip through all that because we don't really care for this. PCOS, we remember he was scoring below average for that, so we don't really care for the panel. Alzheimer's, we remember he was scoring below average for that, so we don't care for the panel. Hemochromatosis, he does not have any hemochromatosis variants. Diabetes, what was he scoring for that? Let's check again. Diabetes. Yes, so he was scoring very high for type 1 diabetes and very low for type 2 diabetes. So let's see diabetes again. Okay, so for lactose persistence, let's not skip over stuff. Hold on. Actually, I'm skipping over a lot of things. I shouldn't do that. For autism, looks like he has a predisposition to higher odds of autism. And by the way, there's definitely some overlap between the genetic predisposition to autism and genetic predisposition to stuff like schizophrenia. Not necessarily in the genes that are used in the calculation here. Like here in my trait predictor, the genetic variations for that predispose somebody to scoring higher for autism don't necessarily have much of an overlap with those that predispose you to scoring higher for schizophrenia. The highest overlap is probably between schizophrenia and bipolar type 1. But like if you score high for schizophrenia, you're also going to score high for bipolar type 1. But for autism, still though, scoring high for autism is very, very interesting. It is an indicator of probably scoring high, probably predisposition to various mental health conditions. So for results from lactose persistence, looks like he is heterozygous for European lactose persistence mutation and probably not lactose intolerant. So he is not lactose intolerant. He does have the European lactose persistence mutation. For the empathy gene and OXTR, looks like he has a predisposition to higher level of empathy based on these. However, how many is that? That's 6 SNPs. Based on these 6 SNPs, 6 genotypes, he has a predisposition to higher level of empathy. Definitely really cool to see. For diabetes, we remember he has really high odds for type 1 diabetes, but really low for type 2 diabetes. And he has GG in his variation of HLA. So based on his genotype in HLA, he has a predisposition to high odds for type 1 diabetes. Definitely very interesting. So he's predisposed to type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune disease, but he's not very particularly predisposed to type 2 diabetes. Very interesting for sure. He does not have hemochromatosis, and for Alzheimer's, no risk variance for Alzheimer's in APOE. Really good to see. Multiple sclerosis, we already know he has risk variance for multiple sclerosis in the HLA gene, so quite cooked there. For cardiovascular disease panel, looks like he has a predisposition to lower odds of cardiovascular issues, quite good. For asthma and epilepsy, he was scoring above average for asthma, but he was scoring below. Actually, he was scoring above average for both. Hold on. Epilepsy. Let's see what he's scoring for epilepsy. Yeah, he's scoring high for both asthma and epilepsy. So he's actually scoring high for both asthma and epilepsy. Myopia panel, he was scoring slightly above average for myopia. We remember that. For facial morphology panel, looks like he has all the European genotypes in EDAR. So he's typical European genotype in EDAR. Another genotype correlating to facial morphology is he's got longer mid-face length. He's got intermediate odds of protruding nasal bridge. He's got larger nose size. He's got 2 genotypes for thinner eyebrows. And he's got lower odds of missing teeth. Also, he's got likely higher odds of nose pointing up. Very interesting. Miscellaneous section. Looks like he does not have micropenis. Really good to see. Looks like for IQ, he's got. Well, I'm not gonna talk about that. Actually, it's kind of really wishy-washy. No fat gene variants and FTOs are estimated in 93609, so he's not predisposed to being overweight. And for RS671, he is not an Asian flusher and he has lower odds of alcoholism and normal risk of esophageal cancer. All right. Now let's talk about the drug response. Looks like his risk of heart failure due to beta blocker medications is essentially slightly below average. What I really want to talk about is the risk of weight gain from taking olanzapine or Zyprexa. So it looks like from taking olanzapine or Zyprexa, it looks like he has more likely to gain weight of taking Zyprexa. He has all these genotypes that predispose him to more likely to gain weight of taking Zyprexa. So it looks like he's definitely predisposed to higher odds of weight gain from Zyprexa. He has a predisposition to lower odds of cannabis-induced psychosis, which is kind of good, but it wouldn't help him when you already have schizophrenia. Having lower odds of cannabis-induced psychosis definitely wouldn't help you. You still can't smoke weed. He has a predisposition to lower than average odds of Parkinson's symptoms when treated with antipsychotics, which is really good for him. Once again, no risk variance for pain hypersensitivity out of 12 total found in SCN9A, which is really good. Once again, really good for him. For sex hormone panel, I'm not really sure if there is much content I can talk about this here. He has a genotype that's typical, which leads to lower levels of sex hormone binding globulin, typical higher levels of testosterone, genotype that leads to lower levels of bioavailable testosterone but higher levels of DHT, and genotype that leads to lower levels of testosterone. Higher levels. So he has lower levels of testosterone but higher levels of estrogen. Very interesting. And genotypes that lead to higher levels of DHT. So lower testosterone, higher DHT, and higher estrogen is what I'm getting from this sex hormone panel. For albinism and the typical traits panel, looks like he does not carry any albino variants, and he's not a carrier of Melanesian blonde hair variants. Also doesn't carry variants for cleft lip and palate. He does not carry variants for familiar Mediterranean fever. For MCHFR panel, looks like he does not carry any variants for autism and coronary heart disease, for impaired folate metabolism, stuff like that. Okay, leukemia panel, no risk variants for leukemia in HLA gene. I think this is an HLA gene. I'm not sure. Yeah, I think it is an HLA gene. For rare diseases in the traits panel, no predisposition to hyper. Let's see how many. Does he have any predispositions to any rare diseases? Let's see. He has this genotype, which leads to 10 times higher odds for glaucoma risk. Very interesting. Let's see, is there any other rare conditions that he's predisposed to? He has this genotype, which leads to 4.6 times increased risk of ankylosing spondylitis. Looks like he has this genotype, which actually leads to a significantly increased risk for rheumatoid arthritis and systemic sclerosis. Definitely very interesting, and actually quite uncommon. But I'm not seeing anything else. I'm not seeing anything that's too uncommon and too unusual. Okay, for celiac disease, he has 2 risk variants in CCR3. He has GG initiation, which leads to highest risk for celiac disease, and there's 2 risk variants here. Okay, he has AA initiation, which leads to not going bald. He's definitely protected from going bald in the AR gene, which is definitely very surprising for somebody who's a European. Actually, let's look up the allele distribution in this variation, and you're going to be very surprised by how uncommon the A allele is for Europeans. So you can see for Europeans, the frequency of the A allele is 0.15. So a genotype like his AA genotype is essentially going to be 0.15 times 0.15. It's going to be like 2% essentially. So 2% of Europeans have the same type of genotype as him, which protects them from going bald. It's very, very uncommon, and it is most frequent in, I think it's sub-Saharan Africans. Yeah, it is. This type of genotype is most frequent in sub-Saharan Africans. So sub-Saharan Africans are the ones who are most protected from male pattern hair loss, especially in the AR gene. But Europeans are the ones who are least protected. But in his case, he's a European. He seems to have this sub-Saharan African-like protection from going bald. Very, very interesting. Crohn's disease, he does not have any risk variance for Crohn's disease, really good to see. Canavan syndrome, no risk variance for Canavan syndrome. HIV and AIDS panel, he actually has 2 protective variants from HIV in this variation, which is really good to see. 90% reduction in HIV viral load. HLA gene panel, we already saw that he definitely has some predisposition to higher odds of autoimmune disease in the HLA gene. And for the MTRR gene panel, it looks like he has some genotypes for neural tube defects, like 2 risk variants here, 2 risk variants here. But overall, he's doing quite good. For the CBS panel, he has a predisposition to lower homocysteine levels, which is really, really good to see. So he doesn't have a predisposition to elevated homocysteine levels. Quite good. Thyroid cancer, let's see, what was he scoring for thyroid cancer risk once again? Let's show that again. He was scoring below average for that, so he has below average predisposition to thyroid cancer risk, and he's scoring below average for thyroid cancer. For muscular dystrophy myopathy, no risk variance for that, no risk variance for ADL, color blindness, no risk variance for color blindness in any of the 3 genes that we look for. So definitely no predisposition to being colorblind. FTO gene panel, he's got all these genotypes for lower risk of obesity, so he's definitely not predisposed to being overweight or obese. He's got also these genotypes for lower BMI and lower risk of obesity. Very interesting. For syncope panel, based on 7 SNPs, he's got lower odds of syncope, so he's definitely predisposed to lower predisposition to syncope. Bio traits panel, looks like he has reduced odds of hypertension and a range of other issues. Let's see what else. Lower predisposition to anger, wet earwax, normal or smellier body odor, normal colostrum, typical for non-yeast agents. CC in this variation. 2 copies of the farmer CLTCL1 gene variant, which leads to a selective advantage in processing carbohydrate-rich diets, presumably including also lots of sugar. Very interesting. He's got this gene that leads to a significant reduction in the risk of cleft lip and palate, and a reduced risk of non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Very interesting. For cataracts panel, what was he scoring? Look, we can actually determine that right now. Looks like he would score probably average for cataracts. For vitamins and levels, let's see. He has this gene that leads to reduced protection of neurons against glutamate toxicity and decrease the rate of glutamate degradation. Lower levels of B12, typical levels of B12, which is higher levels. Intermediate levels of B6, higher levels of vitamin C. Lower levels of vitamin A, lower levels of vitamin E. Higher levels of vitamin K, lower levels of vitamin K, and higher levels of absorbic acid. Very interesting. Now for the blood group panel, we're moving on to the last final topic of this video. Determine blood group for the sample. This is very decisive. The blood group panel for him is very, very, very precise. It was determined with very high precision and accuracy. He definitely has blood type A. No other blood type is possible for him. So definitely blood type A for him. Well, this was it for this sample. This is essentially it. Thanks for watching. The link to download the raw DNA file, as always, will be in the description of the video. And the link to try out my trade predictor executable, which is the tool that I use to generate these reports on these web pages that contain the health and trade reports. The link to download that will be in the description of the video as well. It is currently $13 on my itch page, but it will be a lot more expensive starting from May 22nd. I think it will be in the 20s. It's going to be 20 something dollars. I'm not sure. I'm not exactly set on the price yet, but it's going to be 20 something dollars essentially. Anyway, well, thanks for watching. Leave a like and subscribe. Goodbye.